Okay, so in this lecture, I'm going to be discussing the second part of Chapter 10, which is looking at sexual harassment in the workplace for women and looking at social policy and women working. These are both found in Chapter 10. Okay, so sexual harassment and making a difference, those second two topics. If we think about what sexual harassment is, we can define it in legal terms, and that kind of helps us understand sort of the two major ways to think about sexual harassment. So, the first way to think about sexual harassment is when um, complying with some sort of sexual demands that someone is making on you at work is a condition of your employment there, right? So this is called quid pro quo harassment. And this is when, for instance, a boss approaches an administrative assistant and says, hey, how about we go for a drink Friday night? And she doesn't want to go, and he repeatedly asks her and insinuates that she is going to be rewarded on the job if she will go out with him, or alternately that she will face problems in her job if she doesn't go out with him. So those sorts of unwanted sexual advances or behavior that her employment is then conditional on, that would be considered quid pro quo harassment. Okay. The second type of sexual harassment is more broad. It's more the hostile work environment type of harassment. And this is where there's something offensive of a sexual nature that's going on. That's creating a hostile work environment. Maybe it's a regular occurrence of obscene remarks in front of a particular woman, or in front of all the women in the office by by certain people in the office. Maybe it's demeaning jokes. Maybe it's suggestive comments about somebody's sexuality or their body or their personal life, or any type of material that's threatening or aggressively sexually toned, or just sexually toned at all in the workplace. An example of this might be if somebody has pictures up in their cubicle of women's body parts, or maybe a lewd picture or a lewd cartoon demeaning women in some way. So if you think about how often does this type of work environment exist, well, it's quite a bit. And if you think in terms of how much harassment in general occurs, random sample surveys over time have indicated that 35 to 50% of women in the U.S. have experienced harassment of this type in the workplace. If you look at a federal employee survey that comes out annually, it generally reports between 42 and 44% of women say they've experienced sexual harassment at work within the last 2 years. And researchers claim that this is probably an understatement, simply because a lot of people don't realize what all can be considered or is considered sexual harassment under the law. So, for instance, like a lot of the hostile work environment conditions, people, and they may not realize that that's actually sexual harassment. They think that's just people being crude or offensive. But if it's a regular thing and it's creating a difficult work environment for any of the women, then yes, it is a hostile work environment. So let's talk a little bit more about sexual harassment and how it became such a part of the national consciousness in the United States. So in 2016, we had two major things happen. We had Roger Ailes being fired or forced to resign from the Fox News companies, and Fox had to pay a $20 million settlement for a culture of sexual harassment, which apparently had gone on for years at Fox. And we also had candidate Trump. We had the tape that surfaced showing him bragging about groping women and sexually assaulting them. which was followed by several women coming forward and saying they had been sexually harassed by candidate Trump, which he denied. So any of those two events were all over the news, and they caused people to ask the question of what is sexual harassment and what qualifies as sexual harassment. And so that's when really it sort of became a big deal for a lot of us in our everyday lives to think about sexual harassment and what the heck qualified as sexual harassment. And also what are some factors that might elevate a person's risk of being sexually harassed in the workplace. Since sexual harassment is actually considered violence against women. And that's another interesting thing that has come out of just only 35 years that it has been studied in psychology. We do know that it is a type of violence against women. The factors that elevate a person's risk. Well, if you work in a male-dominated occupation such as maybe IT or engineering, you may have you're probably more likely to have experienced sexual harassment in your work. Also, if you work in a male-dominated office or a work group where you're the only woman or one of very few women, you're more likely to have experienced sexual harassment. If you are younger, unmarried, divorced, or lesbian, those basically all women who are not older and married, then you're more likely to have experienced sexual harassment. Additionally, if you're a woman of color or an Asian woman, due to stereotypes about you, you may have been sexually harassed. So those are all factors that may elevate your risk. So we're going to talk next about some of the causes of sexual harassment. What are the causes of sexual harassment? Well, there's really three theories that are out there that have been developed or that have been applied to the problem of sexual harassment. The first one is called sex role spillover theory. And this is basically the theory that sexual harassment occurs when a woman's gender is more salient than her role as a worker, so that men see her first and foremost as a sex object. So this would be an explanation for why in a job where a woman is the only token person there, so her gender becomes salient because she's the only woman in the group, or when the job requires some sort of sexual objectification by the woman, like if she's a waitress who's required to wear a revealing outfit. Think tight t-shirts like Hooters, like at Hooters, or think of short skirts like cocktail waitresses. So anyway, whenever gender is more salient, you might see this sex role spillover according to this theory, and it would harassment then would occur because of the salience of the gender. A second theory is that sexual harassment is an abuse of power. Because men have more formal power in the organization, and they often have more informal influence as well. Men can misuse their power to treat women as sex objects because if they're in power, they can get away with it. And this is supported by research showing that sexual harassment is more prevalent in hierarchical organizations such as the military than in less hierarchical ones like universities. So this would lend support to the theory that it's an abuse of power. A third theory about sexual harassment is that it's part of a larger pattern of societal dominance by men. So according to sociocultural theory, men are dominant in our culture, and sexual harassment is just part of that pattern. They are still mostly socialized. Men are still mostly socialized to initiate sex, be more sexually persistent, and to feel entitled to take what they want. And women on the other side of that are also still more socialized to be compliant and to heed men's demands. Are there profiles out there in the research yet of harassers? No. We do have studies that show that harassment likelihood positively correlates with acceptance of interpersonal violence, authoritarianism, hostile sexism, and belief in rape myths. So that's all we have at this point about regarding profiles of harassers or characteristics of men who are likely to be harassers. So, what are consequences of sexual harassment? Well, I think we're talking about consequences for the victims and as opposed to the harassers, because there's not enough consequences for the harassers at this point. We do know from many studies that targets of or victims of sexual harassment often will detach and withdraw from their coworkers, their organization, and their work. Oftentimes, they're struggling to cope with the hostile work environment or the unwanted sexual advances, and so they just remove themselves. They just withdraw and back off because they don't know what else to do, which is a expected response to this type of trauma. Psychological consequences of harassment can be devastating, and we know this from clinical studies. That harassment definitely interferes with a woman's commitment to her job, any job satisfaction they get from doing their job, as well as their physical and psychological health is impacted by the harassment. They may suffer from cognitive dissonance because they may think that they've done something to bring on the harassment. So their initial reactions may include self-doubt, confusion, maybe even guilt, because the women think or blame themselves or think there's something they must have done to cause it or encourage the harassment. So those are all problematic consequences for the women who are harassed. A little bit more on sexual harassment. A national study of over 3,000 women found that those who had been harassed, there was a link there with major depression and also PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, right? And if you compare women who have not experienced harassment and those who have, it's a huge difference. 9% of non-harassed women experience PTSD, whereas 30% of harassed women have PTSD symptoms. So a big difference there. So we know that there's definitely a possible large effect for women who've experienced harassment, that they will suffer from PTSD symptoms. Organizational climate can be a good predictor of whether sexual harassment will occur. So that's important to think about, for organizations to think about, because they can reduce sexual harassment by educating their employees about the problem and developing policies and programs designed to impact it and reduce it. Organizations obviously should provide support systems for women who have been harassed and protect them from retaliation if they choose to report the harassment. So that's it on sexual harassment. And our because this slide went on so long, or this slide set, I'm going to wait and have another slide set on the last part of the chapter.